sticking around, and it'll be tough to follow that act with pandas and jihad, but I'll do my best to try to not be the weak link. My objective is really less to talk about the terrorism-trafficking nexus and more to focus on how that context has shaped security apparatuses in the region. I think it's fair to say that state security apparatuses across Central Asia have been immersed in dealing with issues of organized crime, terrorism, and drug trafficking, and especially as to how they interact. And it's not necessarily combating these only. Of course, they are at times participating in these activities, especially drug trafficking. This is research as part of a broader project, but this particular research is based on a series of expert interviews conducted in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan over the last year. A range of people in the security apparatuses, and political analysts, journalists, and NGO people, and so forth. And the broad thesis is that what we're seeing, or we may not be seeing it, but what is occurring is these state security institutions are evolving and are, in a sense, crystallizing in very different directions. And I'm going to talk about how Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, even though maybe from a distance they look alike, they really have very different security apparatuses, especially with regard to their capacities and their short and long-term trajectories. And I've kind of given a label there that indicates that. Kyrgyzstan has a whole series of short-term problems. It is not likely to really address many of its security issues in the near term. There's specific problems that it has to grapple with, and yet it has a lot of positive prospects for the long term. And Tajikistan is the exact opposite. Tajikistan has evolved relatively rapidly with a whole series of improved capacities that enable it to be quite effective in the short term, but over the long term, has serious drawbacks, real long-term concerns about its long-term trajectory. And at the end of the talk, I'll have a couple of quick policy implications for what is called security sector assistance. That's SSA on my charts here, on my slides. That's U.S., Chinese, Russian, any kind of foreign security assistance. And so the implications are, basically the broader lesson is if you're going to be pouring money into these countries' apparatuses, you might want to keep in mind how they're evolving. The more academic, well, I guess the academic and the policy takeaway as well is that these institutions, as they evolve in different directions, become, and here's the term crystallizing, and I'm taking it from an academic source, but it means also to emphasize how they become somewhat fixed. And so as these things are evolving and changing, we need to pay attention to them because these institutions will be very difficult. They become path dependent. They become difficult to change. So with that, I'm going to move forward into first talk about Kyrgyzstan. And as I assembled the data from the various interviews in Kyrgyzstan, it became clear that which is no surprise to many of us, that Kyrgyzstan has an institutionally weak apparatus. It is resource constrained, of course, and it has a series of, has grappled with a couple of crises in 2005 and 2010, and has a divided political elite. And that has left it really with two, maybe three fundamental short-term problems. First of all, that there has been a decline in the capacities of its security apparatus over the last 10, 15 years. Especially hitting a low point between 2005 and 2010, which again is no surprise to many of us. But it really has not made many strides in recovering from that period. For example, the Drug Control Agency in Kyrgyzstan was created in 2003. It was opened and then closed, and then opened and then closed again. And now, just recently, in the middle of 2016, it was swallowed up in a turf battle by the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Even when it was on its own and it was operating, it had, if you divide up these institutions between strategic analysis, mining the data, trying to figure out where these drug trafficking problems are, where terrorist attacks are occurring, where crime is growing or diminishing, and then you have an operational component. On the strategic side, they really were pretty thin, the Drug Control Agency. They had 10 people trying to track trafficking, and of those 10, really only 2 were really tracking, and that comes from people at the UN ODC who are quite frustrated with the fact that there was so little resources to provided. Other examples of a diminished capacity in the wake of the 2010 violence, there were a couple of efforts to try to bolster state security capacity to try to deal with some of the problems in southern Kyrgyzstan. There was an attempt to create a situation room. So if there's another crisis, we could have a place where all the different security actors can get together and maybe talk to one another and deal with the problem, but that didn't really pan out because there wasn't enough interest on the domestic side, and the foreign funder dropped out. There was an NGO trying to establish an organization in southern Kyrgyzstan that would basically be an early warning system to address future conflicts that might arise. And that too was supported by the NGO sector, but wasn't really supported by the security apparatus. And so along with the fact that we have these intersecting security problems of instability, drug trafficking, and organized crime, and yet the security apparatuses in Tajikistan and in Kyrgyzstan, to be fair, remain pretty sectorally focused. They're only focusing on one of these. They're kind of in silos, to use one respondent's term. But they're not looking at the intersection of these. That's kind of the broader project that I'm looking at, but that is also kind of an incapacity. A second major problem for Kyrgyzstan is that it's become, that the security institutions have exacerbated and become part of a broader trend of exacerbating ethnic and regional tensions, especially ethnic tensions. Many of us are familiar with this, but just to fully flesh this out, this is a serious problem for Kyrgyzstan. Security agencies in Osh and even in Jalalabad and Batken provinces, but especially in Osh, have been fairly active in carrying out targeting ethnic Uzbeks for arrests, for searches, entering their home without permission, or just claiming they have permission. This is put forward as a security program to enhance security, of course, by the government, but in fact it's also devolved into a means of extorting payments, and naturally, as you can imagine, this has generated a lot of mistrust and a lot of concern among the ethnic Uzbeks, and according to a number of NGOs and people that I've talked to, there's a lot of so-called self-isolating where people sort of, especially those who are religious and ethnic Uzbek, will self-isolate and try to preemptively avoid the state, shall we say. Which raises questions about what are the long-term consequences? Is this kind of ethnic component in security agencies going to generate this, the standard cycle of repression that leads to isolation, marginalization, and perhaps real or perceived extremism, and then more repression and so forth? I think that this is something where I might touch on Noah's work, not maybe now, but certainly down the road. On the positive side, because sometimes I'm deemed as being somewhat pessimistic, I think. On the positive side, and one last point is that Kyrgyzstan's security apparatus is also heavily staffed in the southern areas, mostly by Kyrgyz, and even though Uzbeks constitute, say, 45% of the population of Osh, that is not reflected in the security apparatus. So that's a real problem as well. But to think more positively, long-term, Kyrgyzstan's initial liberalization, politically and economically, go quite some distance in developing long-term prospects for its state security development. And this is because early liberalization makes security apparatuses more accountable to the public and more accountable to the government. And it doesn't really give Kyrgyzstan real advantages. It's not a plus side, but it removes many of the pitfalls that characterize security sector development in weak and fragile states. And first of all, so Kyrgyzstan does not have much evidence of its security apparatus likely to be forming Praetorian guards that would be formed around the political leadership. There's plenty of rent-seeking, there's plenty of corruption. If you want to get more information on this, you just have to read Johan Engvall's, he is not here by the way, but he has a book out that gets at this. But the security apparatus is not spearheading this kind of rent-seeking as in other countries, so they are really further removed from this. And this is this is quite important because it ensures that security institutions do not undermine the long-term legitimate governance in these countries, in Kyrgyzstan. And in terms of drug trafficking in particular, a number of respondents made the distinctions. I don't know how accurate this is, but roughly stating that while Tajikistan's security apparatus is heavily involved in drug trafficking, in Kyrgyzstan, the term repeatedly used in interviews was there are key persons involved who provide protection, but you don't see entire apparatuses or parts of apparatuses involved. Of course, we have no way of knowing that. You can't like run an experiment on that, so sort of take it for what it is. And because of all of these reasons, Kyrgyzstan does not exhibit, with the exception of Osh and Jalolabad, does not exhibit many of the abuses of authority that we see in some of the other countries. For example, extortion and predation. It is less prevalent. It, of course, is there, but it is much less prevalent. And then lastly, Kyrgyzstan has not received as much state security assistance from Russia and from the US. It has had plenty, well, not plenty, but it has had some, but not nearly as much as Tajikistan. And for that reason, because it hasn't been the recipient of external funds, it has not generated what's called a moral hazard effect or danger of that. And that's basically that where security actors will forego acting on threats because they want to continue to receive funding, and it's in order to continue to receive funding, you have to continue to have threats. And as you'll see in the case of Tajikistan, that is a problem. That security apparatuses want to ensure that they continue to have incoming funding because they become dependent on that. And so they may at times, maybe not forego acting, but continue to foster the idea that there is a security threat out there. So short-term problems embedded in Kyrgyzstan's institutions, but it is not saddled with a lot of the long-term burdens. And Tajikistan exhibits a very marked difference. Tajikistan, you know, I did dissertation field research in Tajikistan, and it ended in 2002. I went back in 2007 or 2008, and compared to that time, Tajikistan looks nothing like it did then. It is much. The security apparatus is much more enhanced, and it is a marked change. There has been significant infusions of foreign and domestic security assistance into the country, both in general and in Dushanbe and along the border. And so this has clearly led to a couple of benefits, a couple of short-term advantages. Number one, just greater capabilities. There's closed-circuit TV in covering, kind of monitoring, covering much of the center of downtown Dushanbe. There's supposedly a big room, lots of TV screens where they're monitoring what you do. So FYI, you know, be careful when you're in central Dushanbe. They have forensic resources that they didn't have before, and of course, border infrastructure is substantially improved. In multiple ways, and then there's these, you know, the special forces have all sorts of equipment and vehicles, and they are, you know, in their tinted windows, their SUVs cruising through Dushanbe and elsewhere. And this has led to more professionalized policing, lower crime rates, really, and a reduction of terrorist attacks or insurgent attacks in the country. So there are there's clearly enhanced security, a general sense of more security among the general public, which is all positive. And another major plus side is that the enhanced security has not led to the targeting of a particular ethnic group or a particular region as a whole. There isn't targeting of Uzbeks or Ismailis or of a particular region. Sure, there's important regional differences, but I think that actually, in many ways, the enhanced security apparatus, the inflow of funding, has helped pull the country together since the Civil War, and I think that is perhaps an important point to be made. In terms of long-term problems, however, Tajikistan has has certainly had growing authoritarianism and plenty of examples of corruption, and that has led to several long-term problems. First, the enhanced security apparatus, as many of us are quite aware, has enabled the regime to consolidate the drug trade underneath it, eliminate some of the smaller traders, and this has fostered corruption. There's also been a significant increase in abuses of authority in terms of targeting regime opponents like the IRP, civil society groups, religious adherents. There's an increase and a more systematic extortion of payments from local businesses across Dushanbe. And there's also more systematic targeting of everyday people who come from the regions and want to live in Dushanbe and don't have the paperwork to do so. So this is clearly a problem as well. There's also a problem, which perhaps President Trump might keep in mind as he wants to build the wall, that when you engage in rapid state security advancements, you tend to be not able to really vet who you bring into your apparatus because you're increasing it so quickly. And as a result, Tajikistan has had a lot of defections and problems among its personnel. Of course, there are many prominent cases, 2008, 2010, 2012, and so forth. But there are also many cases on the lower levels, especially among the Border Patrol, where they just have really not a clear, there's not been full control and full vetting over their personnel. That's part of the problem. Another part of the problem in getting control over their personnel is that they tend to be appointing security personnel from Hatlan into Badakhshan, especially the state security, the successor agency for the KGB. And then lastly, dependence on state security assistance from abroad raises real problems for moral hazard effects. That combined with the fact that, like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan uses quotas in its policing and in its security apparatus. It basically has to, actors, various agencies and organizations are supposed to have so many arrests and so many seizures of drugs, and even they're supposed to also meet certain quotas for identifying crimes. So how do you actually engage in appropriate counter trafficking if you have to have a certain number of seizures? It totally makes no sense whatsoever. And it actually, relying on that kind of quota-based policing or quota-based security further fosters this idea that you become dependent on increased foreign assistance and this moral hazard effect where you're less likely to address security problems because you need to maintain a demand. Just to kind of illustrate that, in one interview with the Border Patrol person, he's saying, we don't have enough equipment, we need motorized boats for the Ganj River, we need new helicopters, we can't rely on our old helicopters, and we need drones. And I'm thinking, dude, this is Tajikistan, you know that, right? And drones. And then I'm thinking, sounds like my president. But it illustrates quite well that as long as there's a continued demand for, you need to generate a demand for this inflow of resources so you can continue to have to, fund it. Very quickly, the broader point, kind of going back to some of the academic side of things, as we think about how these institutions are changing over time, I want to emphasize that these institutions are not changing because they're combating terrorism, combating trafficking, or something like that. It's because there are broad influences shaping these institutions, and they're very diffuse, and it's not very interesting, and it's kind of tough to sort of emphasize that, 3:10 in the afternoon, after the coffee is worn off, how these really matter, because they are diffuse, and they're hard to pick. It's hard to identify, and it's precisely because of that we should be vigilant in thinking about that. Institutional factors, the amount of investment in the technical capabilities matter, not only for overall effectiveness, but also because the more effective, the more well-funded the institutions are, the more prone they are to carrying out abuses of authority, of course, and become more dependent on foreign aid and foreign assistance, and it emphasizes moral hazard consequences. If a regime is more open or more closed, if it's more closed, there's a greater tendency, like in Tajikistan, to use security forces for Praetorian Guard duties or target opposition. Economic factors matter because the more open or closed the economy, the more liberal or autarkic it is, shape what are the opportunities for generating wealth outside of the system. And if there are fewer opportunities, you're going to seek illicit forms of wealth, predation, rent seeking, participating, providing assistance for drug trafficking. 2 minutes? Yeah, I'm almost. And ideologically, how do these governments approach minorities, which obviously affects how they address ethnic and regional tensions and abuses of authority. So that's sort of where the causal framework is coming from. What are the broad causal factors at work? And to wrap up, there's some very obvious policy implications, but they're not obvious if you don't take this long-term perspective. If you take a short-term perspective, you may miss them, but the long-term perspective is Kyrgyzstan could clearly use more assistance for its security capabilities in the near term, if it's incrementally improved, incrementally provided. But that kind of state security assistance, the SSA, should clearly be, and obviously be, contingent on mitigating ethnic tensions, because if it does get more capabilities, obviously that spells that's bad news for southern Kyrgyzstan. In Tajikistan, it probably continuing institutional technical support, but clearly make it contingent upon reducing abuses of authority and rent-seeking, which have proliferated and have been in part funded by the US. And also to develop independent ways of assessing threats, not to rely on local governments to do that. Because there is a real moral hazard effect, and we don't know what the threats are, because if we just trust their data, number one, they base it on quotas, and number two, they have an incentive to cook the books, so to speak. So the wrap-up is state security apparatuses are crystallizing and taking very different shapes in Central Asia. If we think about these apparatuses as intersecting networks of power and crystallizing in different forms, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan represent very different forms. We are likely to be stuck with these different forms for quite some time, because they do not just go back to the way they were very quickly. And in terms of thinking about policy implications, it would be wise, I think, to take a long-term perspective when you think about foreign assistance towards these apparatuses. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.